"You can take the guest room for now," my daughter-in-law whispered at my husband's funeral. "After all, the house won't stay yours forever." I was still holding the funeral program when I heard her say it. Richard had been gone for less than 3 hours. His casket was still surrounded by flowers. Friends and relatives were still offering condolences. Yet somehow, while I was trying to remember how to breathe without the man I had loved for 43 years, my family had already started discussing what would happen to everything he left behind. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 69 years old, and 5 days ago, I lost my husband. Richard and I built a life together in Fairfield County, Connecticut. We raised a son, paid every mortgage payment ourselves, survived recessions, health scares, and every challenge that life threw at us. Through it all, Richard remained the calm center of my world. Then one ordinary Tuesday morning, that world disappeared. The funeral was held in a small stone church Richard loved. The sanctuary was filled with soft organ music and white lilies. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, painting patches of color across the wooden pews. It should have been a place for remembrance. Instead, it felt like a stage where everyone was quietly calculating what my future would look like without him. I sat alone in the front row. Ethan, my son, was standing near the entrance greeting guests beside his wife, Vanessa. Every so often I looked toward them, hoping to see the same grief that sat like a stone in my chest. Instead, I saw something else. Efficiency. Planning. Conversations cut short whenever I walked nearby. The kind of behavior that makes you feel like a stranger in your own family. After the service ended, people gathered in the fellowship hall for refreshments. I wasn't hungry. I carried a paper cup of coffee, mostly so my hands would have something to hold. Everywhere I turned, I caught fragments of conversations. I wonder what Margaret will do now. That house must be expensive to maintain. She'll probably downsize. Maybe Ethan can help manage things. None of the comments sounded cruel on their own, but together, they created a picture. A picture of a helpless widow everyone assumed was about to lose everything. Then I saw Vanessa standing with 2 of her friends near the dessert table. She was smiling. Not the polite smile people wear at funerals. A different smile. A confident one. "The property alone is worth a fortune," one woman said quietly. Vanessa nodded. "Well, eventually these things work themselves out." They laughed softly. I looked away before they noticed me listening. My stomach tightened. Richard hadn't even been buried yet, and already they were talking about the future as if I had become an obstacle that needed to be managed. Later that afternoon, Ethan approached me carrying a plate of untouched cookies. "Mom," he said gently, "have you thought about what comes next?" I stared at him. "Your father's funeral ended less than an hour ago." He shifted uncomfortably. "I know. I just mean, there are practical things to consider." Practical things. The words echoed in my mind. For decades, I had been the practical one. I balanced budgets, managed investments with Richard, organized family gatherings, and helped Ethan through every difficult chapter of his life. Yet suddenly everyone spoke to me as though I were incapable of making decisions. As though grief had erased my intelligence. As though losing my husband had somehow made me invisible. I simply nodded and took a sip of coffee. Ethan seemed relieved that I didn't argue. Vanessa glanced over from across the room. The look she gave me lasted only a second, but it told me everything. They thought I was overwhelmed. They thought I was vulnerable. Most of all, they thought I had no idea what Richard had prepared long before any of this happened. And standing there among the flowers and condolences, while people quietly imagined my downfall, I made a decision. I would let them keep believing exactly that. The house felt different when I returned that evening. Not empty. Not yet. Richard's reading glasses were still resting on the end table beside his favorite chair. His coffee mug sat in the kitchen exactly where he had left it a week earlier. A navy blue sweater still hung on the hook near the garage door. Everywhere I looked, there were traces of him. Small reminders of a life we had built together over more than 4 decades. I set my purse on the counter and stood quietly in the kitchen. The silence was overwhelming. For years, Richard and I had ended each day the same way. One of us would make tea while the other talked about something ordinary. The weather. A neighbor. A news story. It never seemed important at the time. Now I would have given anything to hear one more ordinary conversation. I filled a kettle with water and turned on the stove. As I waited, my eyes drifted toward the dining room window. The backyard was bathed in the golden light of early evening. Richard had spent years caring for that yard. Every tree had a story. Every flower bed had been planned with patience. Looking at it now made my chest ache. The kettle began to whistle. I poured hot water into a mug and carried it to the living room. As I sat down, my phone vibrated. Ethan. For a brief moment, I felt relieved. Maybe he was calling because he realized how difficult the day had been. Maybe he wanted to check on me. Maybe he remembered that I had just buried my husband. I answered immediately. Hi, sweetheart. There was a short pause. Mom, I wanted to ask you something. My shoulders sank slightly. What is it? Vanessa and I were talking about the house. Of course they were. I stared at the dark television screen across the room. What about it? Nothing urgent, he said quickly. We were just thinking it might be a lot for you to manage alone. I closed my eyes. Earlier that afternoon, I had heard strangers discussing my future. Now my own son was doing the same thing. I have managed this house for 22 years, I replied calmly. I think I can handle another week. He laughed nervously. That is not what I meant. But it was exactly what he meant. We spoke for another few minutes before ending the call. Not once did he ask how I was sleeping. Not once did he ask whether I had eaten dinner. Not once did he mention his father. After the call ended, I sat in silence. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Sleep had become difficult. I made breakfast and carried a plate of toast to the kitchen table. As I looked through the window, I remembered something Richard had said 6 months earlier. We had been sitting on the back porch watching the sunset. He had seemed unusually thoughtful that evening. Promise me something, he said. What? I asked. He looked toward the trees before answering. No matter what happens, do not let anyone pressure you into making decisions too quickly. I laughed softly at the time. Who was going to pressure me? He smiled, but there had been something serious behind his eyes. Just promise me. I had promised. Back then, I thought he was simply being cautious. Richard had always planned ahead. But now, sitting alone at the kitchen table, I found myself replaying that conversation over and over. It felt different, important, like a piece of a puzzle I had not yet solved. Around noon, another call came. This time it was Vanessa. Her voice was unusually sweet. She asked whether I needed help organizing paperwork, whether I wanted assistance reviewing bills, whether I had considered simplifying my living situation. Every offer sounded helpful on the surface, yet each one seemed designed to move me a little closer toward giving up control. When the conversation finally ended, I placed the phone face down on the table. Then I looked around the room Richard had loved so much. The photographs, the furniture, the memories, everything they spoke about as if it already belonged to someone else. For the first time, a quiet realization settled over me. They were not worried about me. They were worried about what they thought I had. And they were making plans based on assumptions that had not yet been tested. I took a slow sip of coffee and stared out the window. Somewhere beneath my grief, a feeling was beginning to grow. Not anger, not fear, something steadier than that. The sense that Richard had seen something long before I did. And whatever it was, I was starting to believe he had prepared for it. 3 days passed, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same subjects. The house, the accounts, the future. Never Richard, never grief, never the strange emptiness that followed me from room to room like a shadow. On Thursday afternoon, Ethan stopped by unexpectedly. He arrived carrying a grocery bag and wearing an expression that looked rehearsed. I thanked him for the groceries and invited him into the kitchen. For a few minutes, we spoke about ordinary things. The weather, traffic, a neighbor who had recently moved away. Then, almost on cue, the conversation shifted. Mom, have you thought any more about getting help with the property? He asked. I looked up from my coffee. What kind of help? Just managing things. Maintenance, taxes, decisions. He sounded careful, as though he had practiced every sentence beforehand. You should not have to carry all of that responsibility alone. I studied his face. He was 41 years old, yet suddenly he reminded me of a nervous teenager asking permission for something he already intended to do. That is kind of you, I said. But nothing needs to be decided right now. A flicker of disappointment crossed his face before disappearing. Of course. Then he changed the subject. Or at least he pretended to. 20 minutes later, he casually asked whether I knew where Richard kept certain financial documents. An hour after that, he wondered whether I planned to keep the investment property in Vermont. By the time he left, I felt exhausted. Not because of the questions themselves, but because of what they revealed. My son was not acting like a man worried about his mother. He was acting like a man trying to understand an estate. The following morning, I drove to the grocery store. It was the first time I had left the house alone since the funeral. As I walked through the produce section, I heard my name. Margaret. I turned and saw Linda Mercer, an old friend Richard and I had known for years. She embraced me warmly and expressed her condolences. For a few minutes, we talked quietly near a display of apples. Then her expression changed. "I hope you do not mind me saying this," she began carefully, "but I saw Vanessa at lunch yesterday." Something in her tone made me pay attention. "Oh," Linda hesitated. "She was meeting with a real estate agent." I felt very still. "Are you sure?" "Positive. My sister works at the restaurant where they met." Linda looked uncomfortable. "I only mention it because they seem to be discussing your neighborhood." After she walked away, I stood in the middle of the aisle staring at a stack of oranges. A real estate agent. The words echoed in my mind. By themselves, they meant nothing. People met with real estate agents every day. Yet combined with everything else, they felt significant. That evening, I found myself wandering through the house. The family room, the study, the sunroom Richard loved during autumn. Every room held memories. Every room carried traces of a life built over decades. As I passed Richard's office, my eyes settled on his desk. For a long moment, I simply stood there. Then I opened the top drawer. Inside were neatly organized folders, exactly as he always kept them. Tax records, insurance papers, property documents, everything arranged with his usual precision. And resting on top of the stack was a small cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. My heart began to beat faster. I picked it up carefully. The envelope looked old, as though it had been sitting there for quite some time. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Then I remembered the conversation on the porch months earlier. "Promise me something. Do not let anyone pressure you into making decisions too quickly." Standing alone in the quiet office, I slowly turned the envelope over in my hands. Whatever Richard had wanted me to know, I suddenly had the feeling that the answer was waiting inside. For several seconds, I simply stood there holding the envelope. The room felt unusually quiet, as if the entire house were waiting with me. Richard had always been deliberate. He never left random notes or unfinished thoughts. If he had placed this envelope where I would eventually find it, then he had done so for a reason. I sat down slowly in his leather chair and carefully opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter folded into thirds. The sight of his handwriting immediately tightened my throat. I had seen those neat, steady letters on birthday cards, anniversary notes, and grocery lists for more than 40 years. Now they felt like a voice reaching across a distance I could not yet accept. I unfolded the paper and began to read. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then events have unfolded exactly as I feared they might." I stopped. My eyes lingered on the sentence. Richard had written this long before he became ill, long before anyone expected him to leave us. Yet somehow he had anticipated something. I continued reading. He wrote about trust, about patience, about how quickly circumstances can reveal people's true priorities. He never mentioned Ethan or Vanessa by name, but I could feel their presence between the lines. Then one sentence made me sit perfectly still. "Please do not make any major decisions until you have spoken with Harold Bennett." Harold, our family attorney. Richard had trusted Harold for decades. The letter continued. "No matter what anyone tells you, no matter how urgent they claim things are, wait until Harold explains everything." My heart was beating faster now. At the bottom of the page, Richard had written a phone number and underlined it twice. That was all. No explanation. No details. Just instructions. The next morning, after a restless night, I called Harold's office. His assistant answered immediately and transferred me to him. The moment he heard my voice, his tone softened. "Margaret, I have been expecting your call." I sat straighter in my chair. "You have." Richard and I discussed this possibility extensively. There was a brief pause. "I think it would be best if we met in person." We arranged lunch for the following afternoon. After hanging up, I stared out the kitchen window. The conversation had left me with more questions than answers. Yet for the first time since the funeral, I felt something unusual. Direction. A path forward. Later that day, Ethan called again. His timing felt almost uncanny. "Mom, Vanessa found a few listings for smaller homes nearby," he said casually. "Nothing serious. We were just looking." I looked across the room at the framed photograph of Richard on the bookshelf. "That seems premature." Another pause. We are only trying to help. I had heard that phrase many times recently. Every suggestion, every conversation, every recommendation arrived wrapped in concern. Yet beneath the concern, there was always pressure. Gentle pressure. Persistent pressure. The kind that slowly pushes people toward decisions they never intended to make. I appreciate the thought, I replied calmly. But I am not making any decisions right now. Ethan sounded disappointed. Okay, Mom. After the call ended, I walked through the house again. The familiar rooms no longer felt quite as fragile as they had a week earlier. My grief remained. It was present in every corner, every memory, every photograph. But alongside the grief, another feeling had begun to emerge. Curiosity. Why had Richard been so careful? Why had he trusted Harold with something important enough to leave behind written instructions? And most importantly, what exactly had everyone else assumed about my situation? That evening, I noticed a black luxury SUV parked across the street for nearly an hour. Perhaps it meant nothing. Perhaps it belonged to a visitor. Yet when it finally drove away, I found myself wondering whether other conversations were taking place without my knowledge. Conversations about property, about assets, about expectations. Richard had always believed that money revealed character more quickly than success ever could. At the time, I thought it was simply one of his observations about business. Now I was beginning to understand what he meant. And as the sun disappeared beyond the trees and shadows stretched across the backyard he loved so much, I realized something else. Whatever Richard had prepared, he had not done it because he expected me to be weak. He had done it because he expected others to underestimate me. The next afternoon, I drove to downtown Stamford for my meeting with Harold Bennett. The office building overlooked Long Island Sound, and Richard had always joked that Harold charged extra for the view. As I parked my car, I found myself remembering the dozens of times Richard and I had visited this place together over the years. Back then, the meetings had been routine. Estate updates, tax planning, investment reviews. Nothing dramatic, nothing memorable. Yet as I stepped into the elevator, I had the feeling that this visit would be different. Harold greeted me personally when I arrived. He looked older than I remembered. His gray hair seemed thinner, and there were deeper lines around his eyes. Still, his handshake remained steady. "Margaret," he said warmly, "I am glad you came." He led me into a private conference room overlooking the water. After offering coffee, he closed the door and sat across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he reached into a leather folder and removed several documents. "Before we discuss anything else," he said, "there is something Richard wanted me to tell you." My pulse quickened. Harold folded his hands carefully. "Your husband loved you very much. He trusted you completely. More importantly, he understood human nature better than most people." I waited quietly. Harold opened the first document. "About 2 years ago, Richard became concerned." "Concerned about what?" I asked. Harold chose his words carefully. "About how certain people might behave if they believed you were vulnerable." The room suddenly felt smaller. "He never mentioned names," Harold continued. "But he wanted safeguards in place. He wanted to make sure no one could pressure you into making decisions before you understood the full picture." I thought about the phone calls, the conversations, the real estate agent, the constant suggestions that I should simplify my life. Suddenly, Richard's concerns no longer seemed theoretical. Harold slid a document toward me. "This is why he instructed you to meet with me before discussing any financial matters with anyone." I glanced at the pages but did not yet understand what I was seeing. There were numbers, accounts, ownership structures, trust agreements. My eyes moved across the paperwork slowly. "Richard reorganized several assets over the past few years," Harold explained. "Most of the details were intentionally kept private." I looked up. "Private from whom?" Harold met my gaze. "From everyone except you." For several seconds, I simply stared at him. Then a memory surfaced. About 18 months earlier, Richard had insisted on taking a weekend trip to Boston. He claimed it was for business. When I asked questions, he smiled and said, "Just trust me." At the time, I thought little of it. Now I wondered whether that trip had something to do with what Harold was showing me. "There is more," Harold said. He opened another folder. "Much more." As the meeting continued, pieces of a puzzle slowly began falling into place. Companies I barely remembered. Investments Richard rarely discussed. Transactions that stretched back years. Nothing illegal. Nothing improper. Simply careful planning conducted by a man who believed preparation was an act of love. Nearly 90 minutes passed before Harold finally leaned back in his chair. "Margaret," he said gently, "I know this is a lot to absorb." He was right. My mind felt overwhelmed. Yet beneath the confusion, another realization was beginning to take shape. Richard had not left things to chance. Every conversation I had endured since the funeral suddenly looked different. Every assumption people had made about my future rested on information they did not actually possess. As I gathered the documents and prepared to leave, Harold stopped me. "One more thing." I turned back toward him. Richard believed there would come a moment when people revealed who they truly were. His expression softened. He hoped he was wrong, but he wanted you protected if he was right. Driving home along the shoreline that afternoon, I thought about those words. And for the first time since Richard's funeral, I felt something that had been missing for days. Not relief, not happiness, confidence. Because whatever everyone thought they knew about my situation, they were about to discover how little they actually understood. When I arrived home, I carried the folder from Harold's office into Richard's study and placed it carefully on the desk. For a long time, I simply sat there looking at it. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched across the backyard, casting long shadows over the garden Richard had spent years cultivating. Everything looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt the same anymore. The information Harold had shared was still settling into place inside my mind. Richard had never been secretive with me. We discussed almost everything. But now I understood that some of his planning had been intentionally quiet. Not because he did not trust me, because he wanted to protect me. That evening, I reviewed the documents more carefully. Page after page revealed the scope of what Richard had built over decades. Investments, real estate holdings, business interests, trust structures. Some assets were familiar. Others were completely new to me. Harold had not exaggerated. Richard had spent years organizing everything with extraordinary precision. Then I reached a page that made me stop breathing for a moment. I read the number twice. Then a third time. $28 million. The figure sat on the page in simple black ink. No dramatic language. No explanation. Just a carefully documented reality. I leaned back slowly in the chair. For the past week, people had spoken to me as though I might struggle to pay property taxes. As though I would need to sell my home. As though I would eventually depend on others to manage my affairs. Meanwhile, they had absolutely no idea what Richard had arranged. I closed the folder and stared out the window. Surprisingly, I did not feel triumphant. I felt sad, because the money itself was never the point. I would have traded every dollar to have one more evening with Richard sitting across from me at the dinner table. One more quiet conversation. One more ordinary day. The next morning, my phone rang shortly after breakfast. Vanessa. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but answered anyway. Her voice sounded cheerful. "Margaret, I wanted to check in and see how you were doing." The sudden concern almost made me smile. "I am doing fine." "Good." Ethan and I were talking. We thought it might be helpful to schedule a family meeting soon, just to discuss practical matters. Practical matters again. That phrase seemed to follow me everywhere. "What kind of practical matters?" I asked. "Nothing major," she said quickly. "Just future planning. Making sure everything is organized." I thanked her politely and ended the call a few minutes later. Less than an hour afterward, Ethan called as well. His conversation sounded remarkably similar. Different words. Same destination. By now, the pattern was impossible to miss. They wanted information. They wanted clarity. More specifically, they wanted access to details they assumed I did not fully understand myself. That afternoon, I received an email from Harold. Attached was a formal notice regarding the reading of Richard's estate documents. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Family members would attend. Certain advisors would be present. Everything would finally become official. As I read the message, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. For days, I had been reacting, listening, observing, learning. Now the timeline was becoming clear. Everyone seemed eager for that meeting. Everyone appeared confident about what they believed would happen next. They imagined a future built upon assumptions. Assumptions about my finances. Assumptions about my dependence. Assumptions about my ignorance. I folded the printed notice and placed it inside the folder. Then I walked through the house one more time before dinner. The family room, the kitchen, the sunroom overlooking the garden. Richard's presence felt close in each space. And for the first time since his funeral, I found myself smiling. Not because I was happy, because I finally understood something important. Richard had never prepared this plan to punish anyone. He had prepared it to reveal them. And very soon, everyone would have an opportunity to show exactly who they were. The days leading up to the meeting passed quietly on the surface, but beneath that calm, I could feel anticipation building. Ethan called twice more. Vanessa sent several messages. Each interaction followed the same pattern. They were polite, thoughtful even. Yet every conversation seemed carefully aimed toward the same destination. Information. They wanted reassurance about the future. More accurately, they wanted reassurance about the future they had already imagined. On Sunday afternoon, they invited themselves over for lunch. I spent the morning preparing sandwiches and a simple salad. Years of habit are difficult to break. Even after everything, part of me still wanted to believe we could sit together as family. When they arrived, Vanessa carried a bouquet of flowers. The gesture would have seemed sweet if it had not felt so sudden. She placed them on the kitchen counter and looked around the room. Her eyes lingered on the furniture, the artwork, the hardwood floors. Small details, but I noticed them. We sat down to eat. For the first 15 minutes, conversation remained harmless. Weather, travel plans, neighborhood news. Then Vanessa set down her glass and smiled. "Have you thought about what comes after all of this?" she asked gently. "After all of what?" I replied. "The paperwork, the estate matters, the adjustments." There was that word again. Adjustments. As though my entire life were simply waiting to be reorganized. Ethan leaned forward. "We just want to make sure you are taken care of." I nodded. "That is very kind." Neither of them seemed satisfied by the answer. A few minutes later, Vanessa mentioned a luxury retirement community she had recently toured. According to her, it had beautiful walking paths, a fitness center, and weekly social events. She described it with surprising enthusiasm. I listened quietly while taking small bites of my lunch. When she finished, I simply said, "I am very happy here." A brief silence followed. Then the conversation moved on. After they left, I cleared the dishes and stood at the kitchen sink looking out toward the backyard. Richard used to say that patience was underrated. Most people, he believed, revealed themselves if given enough time. I was beginning to see exactly what he meant. 2 days later, Harold called. "Everything is ready," he said. "The meeting will take place Friday morning." I thanked him and wrote down the details. When I hung up, I felt surprisingly calm. The anxiety that had followed me since the funeral was slowly being replaced by clarity. Not because I knew every answer, because I finally understood the situation. Everyone was operating from assumptions. They believed they understood Richard's estate. They believed they understood my finances. Most of all, they believed they understood me. Friday arrived with bright skies and cool autumn air. I woke early and made coffee. Then I walked through the house one room at a time. The family room, the dining room, the study. Everywhere I looked, I saw traces of a life Richard and I had built together. Not a collection of assets. A life. That distinction mattered more than anyone seemed to realize. Before leaving, I paused beside a framed photograph taken during our 40th wedding anniversary trip to Maine. Richard was smiling at the camera. The ocean stretched behind him. For a moment, I found myself smiling back. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" I said softly. Of course there was no answer. Yet somehow, I felt less alone. I gathered my purse, locked the front door, and walked to my car. Across town, people were preparing for a meeting they believed would confirm everything they expected. Some anticipated opportunities. Others anticipated control. A few probably anticipated wealth. What none of them understood was that the story they had been telling themselves for the past week was built on a foundation that did not exist. And within a few hours, that foundation was about to disappear. The conference room was already half full when I arrived. Harold stood near the windows reviewing documents while several assistants arranged folders around the polished oak table. Ethan and Vanessa were seated together on one side of the room. They looked relaxed, comfortable, almost excited. As I took my seat, Vanessa greeted me with an unusually bright smile. "Good morning, Margaret." I returned the smile politely and sat down. Over the next several minutes, additional attendees arrived. Accountants, advisors, a representative from one of Richard's business partnerships. Everyone exchanged quiet greetings while waiting for the meeting to begin. Through it all, I remained silent. I noticed Ethan checking his phone repeatedly. Vanessa leaned toward him several times, whispering comments that made him nod. Whatever conversation they were having seemed optimistic. Eventually, Harold closed the conference room door and took his place at the head of the table. The room settled into silence. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "Today we will review the estate planning structure established by Richard Whitmore." His voice was calm and professional. The first portion of the meeting focused on routine matters: property records, existing agreements, administrative details. Nothing surprising. Yet as the presentation continued, I noticed subtle changes around the table. Several people appeared confused. Others exchanged brief glances. The assumptions many had arrived with were beginning to collide with reality. Then Harold opened a different folder. The atmosphere shifted immediately. "Several years ago," he said, "Richard undertook a comprehensive restructuring of his holdings." Ethan straightened in his chair. Vanessa folded her hands together. Harold continued, "Those changes were implemented through a series of trusts, ownership entities, and protected investment arrangements." The room grew very quiet. Page after page appeared on the screen. Charts, ownership diagrams, financial summaries. The structure was far more extensive than anyone seemed to expect. Ethan's expression changed first. Confusion replaced confidence. Vanessa continued watching attentively, but I could see tension beginning to appear around her eyes. Harold moved carefully through each section. He explained how specific assets were managed, how decision-making authority had been assigned, how future distributions would operate. Every answer seemed to generate new questions. Finally, Ethan raised his hand. "I am sorry," he interrupted. "Who controls these assets now?" Harold looked directly at him. "Your father was very specific on that point." He opened another document. The sound of turning pages echoed through the room. Then he read the relevant section aloud. As the words filled the conference room, every face seemed to freeze. Complete authority over the primary holdings rested with a single individual. Not a committee, not a board, not multiple heirs. One person. Harold lowered the document and looked toward me. Several heads turned in the same direction. For a moment, nobody spoke. Ethan blinked several times as though he had misunderstood what he heard. Vanessa stared at Harold, then at me, then back at the documents. "There must be some mistake," she said carefully. Harold shook his head. "There is no mistake." Another silence followed. This one lasted longer. I sat quietly with my hands folded in my lap. I felt no urge to celebrate, no desire to embarrass anyone. I simply watched reality arrive. Weeks of assumptions, days of planning, endless conversations about what should happen next. All of it had been built on a version of events that never existed. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone now. In its place was uncertainty, questions, disbelief. Harold closed the folder in front of him and adjusted his glasses. "There is one final section we still need to review," he said, "and I believe everyone will find it particularly important." As he reached for the last document Richard had prepared, I noticed something for the first time since entering the room. Vanessa no longer looked confident. She looked worried. Harold allowed the silence to settle before opening the final document. Nobody spoke. The confidence that had filled the room earlier had completely vanished. Ethan sat motionless, staring at the papers in front of him. Vanessa looked as though she were trying to calculate a new version of reality, fast enough to catch up with what she had just learned. Harold adjusted his glasses and began reading. The document was not about money. It was not about properties or investments. It was about responsibility. Richard had written a personal statement to accompany his estate plan. His words were clear, thoughtful, and unmistakably his. He spoke about family, about gratitude, about character. He wrote that wealth was never the most valuable thing a person could leave behind. Trust was. Respect was. Integrity was. As Harold continued reading, I found myself hearing Richard's voice in every sentence. Then came the passage that changed the atmosphere completely. Richard explained that he had intentionally structured his affairs so that no one would be rewarded simply for expecting an inheritance. Any future financial gifts, discretionary distributions, or additional family benefits would remain entirely under my control. Not shared control, not advisory control, complete control. Another silence filled the room. Ethan lowered his eyes. Vanessa stared at the table. For the first time since the funeral, neither of them seemed interested in speaking. Harold continued. Richard had also included a personal note addressed directly to me. Harold handed me the letter. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper. The room remained silent while I read. Margaret, if you are reading this, then you have already discovered what I hoped would never be necessary. People often reveal themselves when they believe someone else has become weak. Do not let that change who you are. Be generous when generosity is deserved. Be patient when patience is wise. But never surrender your dignity to make others comfortable. I paused and swallowed hard. Those words felt less like instructions and more like a final conversation. A final act of protection from the man who had spent 43 years standing beside me. When I finished reading, I carefully folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody challenged the documents. There was nothing to challenge. Everything had been planned carefully, legally, thoughtfully. Harold closed the final folder. That concludes the review, he said quietly. One by one, people began gathering their papers. Several advisors approached me to offer condolences and kind words before leaving the room. Soon only a handful of us remained. Ethan finally looked at me. For the first time in weeks, I saw uncertainty rather than confidence. Mom, he said softly. I did not realize. His voice faded before he could finish. I nodded gently. I know. Across the table, Vanessa remained unusually quiet. There were no suggestions about retirement communities. No discussions about downsizing. No carefully disguised advice. Reality had removed the need for all of it. I stood and gathered my purse. As I prepared to leave, I looked around the room one final time. A week earlier, many people had viewed me as a grieving widow who would soon need guidance. Some had assumed I would become dependent. Others had quietly planned around that assumption. They never imagined that I understood exactly what was happening. More importantly, they never imagined Richard had understood it first. I walked toward the door and paused. Then I turned back briefly. Richard always believed people show you who they are, I said calmly. I think he was right. Nobody answered. They did not need to. The truth was already sitting in the room with us. I left the building and stepped into the cool afternoon air. The sun reflected across the water in the distance. For the first time since Richard's passing, I felt something close to peace. Not because of the money, not because of the estate, because the uncertainty was over. Richard's final gift had never been $28 million. It had been clarity, and with that clarity came something far more valuable than wealth. The freedom to move forward with my dignity completely intact.